right, sorry about that. When you're too confident about technology, that's when it will just fall apart. All right, and actually this is like a perfect segue into the topic of emotional labor and how sometimes you just need to keep your composure even though you're like, oh my gosh, like all the time is ticking away. Okay, so emotional labor. So I wanted to start off with a bit of a recap of my semester and what's been going on. So Thursdays have been like my unlucky days this semester. I've been teaching a course then, and that's not the unlucky part. So I've been teaching an evening online third-year psychology course on Thursday evenings. And it was just a bit of a perfect storm of events of things that happened that impacted my Thursdays. So before the semester even started, it was the weekend before the semester started, and my dad called me and gave me some unexpected news that the uncle that I was closest to passed away. And my aunt and uncle were both in the hospital at the same time, just by chance. And she was actually the one that seemed to be worse off. So if anything, we were bracing ourselves for that and not for him. He seemed to be on the rebound. And this is the uncle that I've been closest to. I lived in Vancouver before, they're in Alberta, and they would visit a lot because my cousin was in Vancouver as well. So I got to know them so well growing up, as well as the 12 years I was in Vancouver. So yeah, as you can imagine, it was unfortunate hearing that news. For a variety of reasons, I chose to attend the funeral service virtually through live streaming. Because one of the reasons was it was on a Thursday. So my class starts at 4:30, and the service started at 4. So I thought, okay, I will tell my students we'll start half hour later, so we'll start at 5. And I was just kind of like thinking, like looking at time and counting it down and thinking at like 4:59, it's like, when do I close that tab? Like how can I use every last second to sit with this and then go into my classroom? And then also thinking, like taking that deep breath between the two things before I join that other virtual room. So we all might feel a little like this owl on the side right now after another school year. And I want to ask all of you, is this the cost of caring for our students? Is this what emotional labor does to us? Is this what we're supposed to expect each semester and each school year? Is this normal and expected? So in this keynote, we'll explore the connection between emotional labor of teaching and the conference theme. So connecting with community, I'm reversing a little bit, community, self, and place. So we'll reframe the common discussion of emotional and individual resilience to collective responsibility. So achieving that goal of connected teaching is only possible when instructors themselves are connected. So to your own emotional lives, the environments that surround you that hopefully will be recognizing and valuing relational work, and to the communities of genuine mutual care. Okay, so as we all know, and as these news headlines highlight, it's been pretty rough for universities and colleges the last few years. So there's been a decline in student enrollments, international and domestic, rising costs and financial pressures, often leading to whole programs, multiple programs ending at a school, deferred infrastructure maintenance, hiring freezes, layoffs, as I well know, losing jobs and cherished colleagues. And then tied to this, there might also be poor change management. So when you have new people coming in and out, there might be increased workloads for individuals. If you are so fortunate to have that job, but then your workload is increasing. Class sizes, I've noticed at Dalhousie, is just getting bigger too, because the more they lay off faculty, then they still need to teach the same amount of students. So then the classes are just becoming so huge. I think that that's the biggest support that we're asked for at our center this past year. It's like, how do I teach a class that's now doubled in my normal size? So your job will change, but the supports aren't necessarily changing. And then several provinces, Nova Scotia included, have introduced government and policy changes that expand the government authority and oversight in areas like emissions policies, governance structures, and institutional planning. And sometimes it's conflicting with our personal or professional values. And as some of the headlines here show, even factors like AI play into this. So adding that added pressure to detect when AI is being used, when you don't want it to be used. So catching that academic plagiarism. And I find personally like that's an extra toll because it's something new that we're looking for. And it takes more mental energy, I think, than looking for other forms of academic dishonesty or other pieces that you might be looking for in assignments. So when we think about the UPEI context, so we'll zoom into this school. So there's been a lot happening, as you know, the last few years. So I won't repeat it and make you relive the trauma, but you see the headlines there, you know, you've lived through it. And yeah, oh yeah, and even the crows won't give you a break. When I was like looking at the headlines, I was like, oh my gosh. So yeah, there's a lot that's been going on, a lot of lingering feelings and things like the faculty strike. Maybe there's lingering distrust, animosity from faculty, students as well. It can be a tense environment when there's so much going on. When we think about our students, so according to Universities Canada, 75% of post-secondary students report struggling with their mental health. So about 32% report poor or very poor mental health. 46% have experienced depression, and 38% have even experienced suicidal thoughts. So even though we're not counselors, we are teachers. Of course, our students' mental health impacts their ability to learn. And as some of you might have experienced, sometimes you get that self-disclosure from a student where they're bringing their, their emotions, what's going on with them in their lives to you. And you have to figure out what to do, how to respond in that moment. And students are also trying to ends meet financially. When they enter the job market, it's not any easier for them to find jobs. So we have that. And then the last point I wanted to mention is tied to the job market, this like devaluing of university education. And it's often tied to universities. Is the kind of the reason why people will say is like we're not being responsive or attentive to current labor market needs potentially or student needs. We might be kind of stuck in some old ways, and maybe that's why people feel like they're not getting their return in an investment. So we are having a hard time too as instructors, and we'll look at that more today throughout the talk. But one stat that really sums it up is along with healthcare workers, lawyers, and corporate executives, university instructors are in the top 10 professions that are most likely to experience burnout. So excessive emotional labor is a contributing factor to burnout. So let's dive into that topic. Okay, so the concept of emotional labor was first coined in 1983, so it's not a new concept. And it was coined by this American sociologist, Arlie Hochschild, in her book, The Managed Heart. And when I think about emotional labor, I've kind of broken it down to three different ways that we might experience it as teachers. So the first one is like editing your emotions to accommodate and elevate the emotions and sometimes even egos of the people around you. So whether it's your colleagues or your students, where we can be like the emotional barometers for our students. We're reading the emotional temperature of the room and adjusting accordingly. And then with our colleagues, maybe we're trying to keep everybody happy, avoid office politics, keeping the peace. It might involve suppressing negative emotions and sometimes even faking positive emotions, regardless of how you're actually feeling. So kind of like when I had to go into my virtual classroom those couple times and thinking, okay, I just to put on that mask and pretend that everything is fine right now. So some other examples of emotional labor and what that could look like in teaching. So it could be like if you have maybe there's like a crying student that comes to your office hours and you're just like, this is thrust upon you, you have to figure out how to deal with that in the moment. Maybe it's having a disruptive student in the classroom and trying to stay calm and patient through that. Maintaining enthusiasm when maybe you were up late the night before, you're exhausted, you're overworked, it's the end of the semester. Perhaps it's offering empathy to distressed students while you're managing your own stress as well. And really just overall trying to maintain composure and warmth and professionalism during times where you might feel personally depleted. The second kind of aspect is social expectations of your role. So altering your authentic self to adhere to what is socially accepted and expected of you in your role, often to please others or for maybe fear of repercussions. So it's like maintaining your energy and presence regardless of how you're feeling, again, managing things like silence and resistance, confusion, disengagement with your students without showing that frustration. And then the third is doing unpopular but important work. So taking on that undesirable or unrewarding work sometimes that everyone is benefiting from, but nobody wants to do it, and it's just like left out there. Nobody really wants to volunteer. So you might feel pressure to volunteer to do, yet another committee, for instance. Maybe you join that committee just to avoid, it kind of seems like the path of least resistance, just to avoid other people complaining that, I don't want to do this, and just like not having somebody say yes, so then you're the one that does that. So, let's see. So just like physical labor or creative labor, mental labor, emotional labor takes time and effort. It's a skill to learn and refine, and it can drain us. So when our emotional bank accounts are overdrawn, then that's when we can experience things like burnout and reduced job satisfaction and employee turnover as well. So we have emotional labor happening just naturally in our teaching environments, but we aren't trained in how to deal with it. We're often not supported either. And it's work that is invisible for the most part. Most people aren't talking about this openly. You're not compensated or valued for it, usually not recognized or rewarded for it either. It's not like emotional labor is counted into performance metrics or your workloads or reward structures in your department. It's not like you're going to put fake smiling on your CV, or as part of your service contributions. But that is part of the job sometimes. So looking at the first part of the conference theme, connection to self. So when we engage in emotional labor, we're often acting out of alignment with how we're truly feeling, or sometimes it's out of alignment with our values. So if we repeatedly do this, we lose touch with our authentic feelings and self, and prolonged disconnection can result in a whole slew of negative, unfortunate symptoms and effects. So what can we do on an individual level to better mitigate emotional labor? So I'm going to share a wide array of strategies today for self, place, and community. And I recognize that some strategies just might not resonate with you. You might not like it. Maybe it doesn't work within your specific context. But I'm hoping that by the end of our time together, there'll be at least one tangible strategy that you can take back and try out. So in terms of self, I feel like self-care, those, the bubble baths and deep breathing, it can only take you so far, and we need more tangible things that really honor the complexity of what emotional labor is. So the first one is even just learning and using the language. So it's like you have to name it before you can tame it. So attending today's keynote is a good first step for those of you that might not have been familiar with the term before. And I've done many sessions on emotional labor at Dalhousie, and the most common reaction that I get from instructors is, I've been feeling like this my whole career, but I just didn't know that there was a name to it. And naming it and realizing that they're not alone and other people are experiencing this helps them make more sense of their experience. So once we have that language, we can start using it. As I mentioned, emotional labor is invisible work, and it will remain invisible unless we start talking about it. So it could be at team meetings, for instance, and having those open kinds of discussions. I remember back during the pandemic, when I was working in a school in Vancouver, we were doing that transition back into the office, and we were still mostly working from home. But there was one colleague of ours in this team meeting, and it was a fairly big team, about 20 of us. And she was a quieter colleague. She didn't contribute much in team meetings. And she shared with us, just out of the blue, how she was finding it really difficult to cope with the transition of going from work from home, returning to the office. She got really emotional too, which again, it's like, this is a quiet person that doesn't share much. And then to see her break down like that was a surprise, but it was kind of like the whole room breathed a sigh of relief, because we were all feeling it, it's just nobody was talking about it. So this big elephant in the room that she just gave kind of permission for us to then let go and start talking about it. Another opportunity possibly to use this kind of language is with supervisors when you're discussing workload. So with when my partner lost their job recently, I told my supervisor up front that I'm gonna need time to process this loss. I actually took a few days off. And it means, I felt like I needed to be upfront about needing to take on less at that time. And I recognize that I have that privilege where I can have such a candid conversation with my supervisor, and not everybody has those safe environments for these kinds of disclosures. But I think that that's an indicator to us that when we have the opportunities to be hiring and putting people into these positions, we should be looking for more than just competency in the role, but looking for traits like emotional intelligence, people who are respecting boundaries, not the workaholics, or at least the people that aren't expecting you to be a workaholic as well, but more on that later. And then with language, even with students, sharing and using that language, being open and transparent about what is going on. At some point, I had mentioned to my students about my uncle's funeral in that class, and just saying, I'm going to be a little scattered brained today, just so you know, and talking about emotional labor there for a brief moment so that they understand that component of teaching as well. I was lucky that I had an empathetic cohort and one that I felt safe doing that with. And I think that they just appreciated that I shared it, because I was just being human about it. They can all relate to that kind of experience. Then I think it's really a nice mental shift to think about not building walls, but actually building gates instead. So having walls up around you is the opposite of emotional labor, and we need some of that emotional labor. So we don't want to completely close ourselves off to other people. We should instead be setting up gates where we're being selective about who is entering, when and where, determining what those boundaries are and where they lie, and opening your gate only when it honors your limits, and closing it kindly when it's a bit of an overextension. Making your availability clear to students could be an example of this, or even just articulating the kind of support that you can offer versus the kinds of support that they would be referred to for. So setting that up from the beginning of the semester, laying out what those supports are that you can offer, to set some ground rules and parameters for the students, because they don't always know. And I think it can also be helpful to decipher between emotional labor that you choose to give and that you value giving versus the ones that you feel obligated out of guilt or pressure, other people's expectations. So like that example of signing up for that committee that you don't really want to do, but you feel pressured to do it. If there's a way that you can back out of that and limit what you're doing, it's always ideal. Another strategy is completing a time inventory. So what I mean by that is thinking about like looking at all of your work hours. How are you spending your time? Are there things that you're doing that are not actually in your job description? And thinking about what are the most time-consuming parts of your day. So can you offload some tasks to other people or automation? A really neat way that I've seen people use AI is creating a virtual assistant where that assistant is answering frequently asked questions from students. So sharing this kind of time inventory, laying out how your time is spent, where there might be times where it's not spent as well, can be useful depending on the type of supervisor you have to be able to have a good conversation starter as to your workload and how certain tasks are using up your time too much or trying to restructure it a little bit. And then the last piece that I wanted to talk about with self is documenting it. I think this is like one of the biggest questions I get about emotional labor. It's like if we are trying to make it more visible and valued and acknowledged, then can we document it in our teaching dossier? And I would say yes. So I think it's helpful to, if this is a value and something that you care about, mentioning, using that terminology again of emotional labor in your teaching philosophy statement. So explaining how you might be maybe fostering student well-being, explaining how it connects to, like I'm making this course design decision and this is helping our students learn better. And so maybe it's like students who feel safe in the classroom, they're going to take more intellectual risks. You could also have a separate section outside of your teaching statement, like a student support section or something like that, that acknowledges this kind of relational and emotional work that you do. So you might be thinking that this sounds a little fluffy, and it might be hard to imagine how this looks in your dossier, but I think it's speaking the language of people that will be reviewing your dossier. So show them the numbers, give them stats, speak that language for them. So give them stats on maybe the number of referrals that you've made to other campus supports, the frequency of advising discussions that you've had, time that you've spent with students, supporting them outside of your traditional scheduled hours, and talking about what those outcomes of those encounters are. So thinking about in terms of student success and retention, how can you make that connection? So if it's things like course assigned decisions, it could be things like flexible deadlines that you're giving, content warnings, even just having transparent grading by using rubrics. All of this is helping support student well-being. And also, you can use emotional labor as a lens when you're looking through your student comments from course evaluations. So looking to see like when students are talking about you being accessible or supportive, creating that safe and inclusive environment, and pulling out those comments to use and highlighting that to display that emotional labor piece. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the second part of our conference theme today, so the connection between emotional labor and place. So emotional labor, it does not happen in a vacuum. There's 4 places that I wanted to touch upon that either breed or buffer against emotional labor of teaching. So obvious first place to start is that physical classroom. So here, I mentioned earlier, the instructor is creating this like emotional climate for students in the classroom. You're creating that, maintaining that climate for students, setting the tone for how safe they will feel, how engaged, curious, anxious, even how capable and confident they feel. That you're all helping to set that tone for them. Classrooms can also carry a memory. It's kind of like a living organism in that sense, where maybe there's some emotional residual content from weeks prior. Maybe there was a particularly heated class discussion and people got a little agitated, or there was, or maybe if there was just like a lesson that totally bombed that like really was obvious, and then how like those effects of it can linger past that one event. And intertwined with memory is sometimes trauma. So with some instructors who are teaching content that is emotionally charged, so things like abuse or death, injustice, inequality, needing to anticipate and prepare for how students are going to respond to that, while also trying to maintain your own emotional response. So maybe this involves modeling like honest communication about like, yeah, like this might be difficult for you to hear, and I'm also having a bit of a challenge dealing with this now, but let's like work through it together. And an instructor might need to repair the classroom community and dynamic if there's a particularly emotionally charged discussion that might create division in the classroom, and trying to repair and bring people back together. An interesting part to this physical classroom is even just the physical aspects of the classroom can be impacting how much emotional labor you are giving. So with large lecture halls, it might be harder to connect with students, and you might feel like you need to put in more, be more animated to reach the students in the back. Even things like poor acoustics or uncomfy seats can increase the amount of emotional labor that you are doing to hold students' attention. It can be extra draining for reasons like that. And I'm sure we've all been in like a hot room or a crowded room, poorly lit rooms even, all of those things that are, that are challenging and inconvenient for you physically. It can deplete your emotional resources as well, and much faster. Then at the institution level, so kind of thinking a bit more macro, so the school itself has different elements that can create or reduce emotional labor. So the physical space again, so having those shared common informal gathering places for staff to decompress as well as connect. Collaboration and cooperation is encouraged, unlike other schools where maybe competition is really what thrives. And having a more collectivist point of view than individualistic. So thinking that team success is more important than just that individual succeeding. And creating stability and predictability is another factor that can help support and foster handling emotional labor better. It's difficult now in this time when so much is changing in post-secondary, but when we have that stability and you can focus on teaching instead of worrying about keeping your job, for instance. And one last thing that I wanted to point out with institutions is so often, I feel like it's been at every workplace I've been at, employees will think that the institution is saying one thing and then doing another thing. So they might say that they're in support of EDIA, but then they have biased practices. So dealing with that cognitive dissonance and those discrepancies can add an extra layer of emotional labor for you, and just another time when it can be draining for you, trying to put together that emotional messaging and then comparing it to that lived experience that you have. Then with your discipline or the field that you're in, it's not so much a literal place, but I wanted to include it because for so many of us academics, your discipline is a time when you felt like you had found home. You feel like this is where you belong, you're with like-minded people. So with a lot of emotional labor, you might feel like you're bogged down with administrative tasks or maybe student behavioral issues, classroom management. So it can be difficult to have any extra energy left to intellectually engage with your discipline. So maybe you're not getting that sufficient time to stay up to date in the field, reading journal articles, going to conferences as much as you like. Or maybe it's just like logistics of the courses that you're teaching. So maybe you're kind of stuck teaching foundational courses and you miss those seminar classes where you can really have those intellectual, engaged, deeper conversations with students. Or I've seen it in many schools, Dal included, where sometimes students are just, it's almost transactional, where it's like they are here, they want the grade, they're in and out, they don't really want to talk and have those deep intellectual discussions as universities were supposed to always be like. So when you have students like that, it can also be dulling the experience because they're not wanting to have those discussions and really dive deep into the content with you. So I think when we can find moments to connect and reconnect with our discipline, it can help us emotionally replenish ourselves. So, and like reminding us why we got into the discipline in the first place. Okay. So then the post-pandemic environment or the online classroom. So here with this, I mean, we were all the physical places that we had and the impacts of that, like seeing your colleagues all the time, having the physical space, being in campus, all of that was removed from us once we went through the pandemic. It also broke down that barrier between personal life and professional life, where now students were getting like a never before seen window into your personal life, with your work becoming your workplace. So it became difficult for many of us to find that line between home mode and work mode because your home was your workplace now. And then, of course, I can't talk about the pandemic without talking about online class teaching. So with online and hybrid teaching, which a lot of us are still doing, it introduced new forms of emotional labor for us that many of us haven't experienced before. So even just maintaining your presence and enthusiasm when you're looking at an audience on your screen of like black rectangles, and you don't know if they, if you're engaging, like if you're connecting with them, if they're understanding the content, because you can't see them, you can't make eye contact. You don't know if they're listening to you. You don't even know if like they're physically there at their computer, or like, which always I think about. So just managing all that uncertainty while teaching can be just an extra thing and burden for us to take on. And an unusual aspect to this online classroom that I always ponder about is just the idea that we're supposed to be creating classroom community, but we're like sitting alone at home while we're trying to build that community with students on the screen. Just the irony of that. And then with things like hybrid teaching, being literally in two places at once and trying to split your attention and care between those two settings. So, just watching the time, of course. So with the last piece, connection to community, so I see it as extractive and reciprocal communities. So I think of emotional labor as like water in a well. So in an extractive community, everyone draws from the same few people and the well eventually runs dry. It's assumed and expected that the job of emotional labor will get done, but it's never named or acknowledged. And it's the kind of environment and workplace where emotional labor is often unevenly distributed. So there's been research that shows that women, racial minorities, early career instructors often get and face the brunt of the emotional labor in academic settings. With a reciprocal kind of community, people are taking turns filling that well and bringing that back up, that water level back up to the right level through things like recognition, solidarity, shared responsibility. Emotional labor will be named, it's discussed openly, and acknowledged as actual skilled professional work, along with the other professional work that we're doing. And with a reciprocal kind of community, they are aware of those patterns of uneven distribution for emotional labor, and they will take deliberate steps to like redistribute those demands. So, in terms of connection to community, I wanted to just mention a few things about colleagues and then like supervisors and senior leadership. So With colleagues, so speaking up when we see that maybe the work is being piled up on just one person. If it's not safe to talk in a group, maybe even having a one-on-one with that person, maybe they're not even realizing how much they're doing and that it's a bit of an abuse of their time and capabilities. And I think it's important to have advocates and allies on your team. Try to find those people that if you don't have a voice or feel like you have a voice and you're heard, that there can be other people hopefully on your team that can be that voice and bring some attention to things that might need to change. And having a culture of debriefing. So if somebody is saying, I've had a particularly difficult cohort this semester, or I'm really struggling with this piece, not thinking that it's somebody complaining, but meeting that comment with care and curiosity instead. And with supervisors and senior leadership, so I think it's so important to make it count, similar to documenting it in your teaching dossier. So with supervisors and senior leadership, I think it would be a very useful exercise for them to conduct something like an emotional labor audit, where you're seeing, honestly, who is carrying different parts of emotional labor and why, how many committees are people on, is it an uneven distribution, and trying to distribute it more evenly. And also emotional labor can be put into the discussions when you have workload allocations or performance reviews even, bringing that work in when you're goal setting with your instructors so that that is still counted as the work that you're doing. And then with training and procedures, so I mentioned that example earlier of how so many faculty have told me that they wish that they knew about this term and this experience earlier on because they felt it all along. So I think introducing this idea of emotional labor to new teachers right when you get orientation to the university, bringing that topic to light so that people are aware of it and that you can set that tone for the kind of community that you are. And then having supervisors and senior leadership completing training on how to respond and recognize emotional exhaustion and other pieces like that in their team, and also providing training to their team members on how to better manage emotional labor. Because as I said, it's a professional skill. So we need to figure out how to better work with this and refine it. It's always going to be there. And also things like shared protocols on what to do in circumstances like if a student is in distress, where are you redirecting them to so that the guesswork is left out when you're actually in that moment. And then the last couple things that I wanted to touch upon is providing opportunities for sharing. So it might be things like peer mentorship, team meetings, maybe it's even just modeling your own behavior. And then with recognition and rewards, so having those kinds of moments where we're not only talking about somebody's research output, but acknowledging when somebody is doing a lot of extra work, when they're doing that relational work, and rewarding that kind of thing, putting into our reward structures. So to end with this speedy version of my talk, so where do we go from here? So on our own, we can't create school reforms, but we can create change through consistent everyday interactions in our own little pocket of the school, on campus, our own sphere of influence. So planting seeds where you are, modeling behavior that you want to see, shifting mindsets, slowly day by day. And I want you to consider what was shared today and what some of this might look like in practice for your team. And begin thinking of how you can implement even just one idea from today. I'm a big believer in the ripple effect. So your one action can influence so many more actions. And I think it's all of these efforts combined that will help us build a caring and sustainable and connected teaching community at UPEI. Thank you.